Welcome back to the second installment of Logstash plugin development. In this episode, we're working on dev containers. So recall from our last episode that one of the pain points that we have with Logstash development is that we have to get all our development tools all ready for us and not conflicting with anything else. So there's some environmental issues that we want to stamp out. And development containers, or containers in general, allow us to encapsulate all those tools and that nice environmental purity in one space and share that nicely with other environments. So in my demonstration today, I'm going to be using Windows 10 Enterprise. That's going to show us a few extra little gotchas. I'm going to be using Docker Desktop, and because I'm running this on Windows 10 Enterprise, this also means I'm going to be using Hyper-V. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code and its notion of dev containers using the remote containers series of plugins. That's going to allow me to do all my code building and authoring using one container, so that's where I'll be doing things like unit testing. And then once I've got my artifact built, that's my Logstash plugin in this case, I'm going to take that to another container. In this case, it'll be an official Logstash container, and I'm going to run that there and use that to do things like end-to-end testing. The concept of dev containers is very useful, and the whole idea of it is that you're here on your local machine using Visual Studio just as you would editing local files. But your code is running within a container, like a Docker container. In this case, it will be a Docker container, but it's a little bit different. The bit that makes it different is that Visual Studio is injecting some of its own code, just not within the container image, but within the container runtime itself. So this is a volatile sort of change. And therefore, all the smarts that need to be provided for the language, that's things like unit testing, linters, syntax highlighting, refactoring, all those rich IDE things that people like, that smarts is going to be running within the container. And therefore, the Visual Studio environment over here is effectively going to be like a remote application. So the source code in this case is just volume mounted, so it's shared. And one of the little tricks we have to play with Windows, because Windows has different line endings, we're going to have to consider how we actually share that to make sure that our environment where the code is running is not going to get confused with the wrong kind of line endings. So I mentioned that I'm using Docker Desktop on Windows 10 Enterprise. In my case, this is also a machine that is bound to a domain. So it has a group policy applied, which does things like control firewall rules and set other policies, such as maybe turning off old versions of SMB, which might, if I was developing this in a different way, cause me some issues, particularly if it comes to sharing folders. Docker Desktop will use Hyper-V, more specifically Docker Desktop on Windows 10 Enterprise will use Hyper-V, although on newer versions of Windows 10, it can also use WSL2. However, I don't recommend doing this. It might work, but anytime that you're creating runtime artifacts for a production system, I would recommend you use something with a more typical Linux kernel running. A good example of why this would be if you're supporting older platforms as well. Windows subsystem for Linux version 2, at the time I tested it, if you were to try and use a rel 6 container, it would immediately crash. Now you could do this on macOS or Linux too if you'd prefer. I'm just doing this on Windows because that's what I use day to day. However, there's nothing that would prevent you from using a different platform. Also, Windows shows up a few more things that makes it a bit more illustrative. So one of the things I'm going to be showing you in this is my container image Logstash plugin dev. And this plugin has everything that you need for creating either Ruby or Java based plugins. You can see the web page for it here, very easy to find. It does have some documentation as to how to use it, which is basically replicating what I'm showing you in this episode. However, it doesn't replicate the documentation that is on the Logstash website, and does not aim to. Now, just remember that this is designed for Visual Studio Code dev containers. However, there's nothing actually specific about dev containers in anything in this environment at all. And as an example of this, a user has shown me that he's actually been able to use this container image for purposes of continuous integration, which I was really thankful for, so thank you. One thing I should mention is at the moment this is only supporting Logstash 7.9. So you'll need to make sure that you pull the right version. At the moment that's only 7.9, but later on we'll get some other versions in there as well. So let's go on and have a bit of a demo. Oops. Okay, so I'm in a directory, and I'm going to use the Logstash plugin generate command. Bear in mind this creates only Ruby based plugins. So I'm going to run the container. I don't need to keep any image, and I don't really, by habit I'm just using it interactively. I'm going to volume mount. Oh, you'll notice I'm doing this in PowerShell, by the way, but the command syntax should be exactly the same as for Bash in this case. Not always the case with PowerShell. So I'm bind mounting my current directory to /work in the container. Plugin dev version 7.9. By default, you're going to get a Bash shell as your entry point, so any args can be passed to Bash. So -c is a Bash argument, and the command that we're going to pass into Bash is simply Logstash plugin generate. The type of plugin that we're wanting, remember we can have input, output, or filter, or codec. We're just creating a filter for this example. The name is going to be taster, so we're going to end up with Logstash filter taster, and the path where we want to actually create it is inside /work, which we've mounted here. That's going to create a directory within there called Logstash Logstash filter taster. So we'll run that. There we go. Just remember, this is effectively still running JRuby, so it takes a little bit of time to start up, but you're not going to need to do this very often. Bear in mind, all of that was running within the container. There's no Logstash tooling on my workstation at all. So let's have a look. Here's the directory that was just created. Logstash filter taster. So now we need to do a little bit of setup so that we can just get into code. So we'll start by doing a git init, so we can initialize a git repository. The dev container stuff, it might be my imagination, but I think that requires it to be in a git repo. This might be a little bit unnecessary now, but this is basically telling git with this particular repository, so local, not a global one, because I don't necessarily want to assume anything about any other projects I'm going to be working on my Windows environment. I'm going to say, sorry, that should be auto. I'm going to say, don't try and manage line endings when I check things in, or check out rather. So I want everything to be native, because my container environment is going to be Linux, and I'm sharing files as globs. I'm not doing any translation. Then I need to make sure that everything on the Windows side is keeping everything as Linux or Unix style line endings. So now that I've got a initial git repo set up, I'll start up code. And now we need to do just a few things to get started. And you'll see it's actually fairly simple. We're going to need, if you haven't got some already, Control Shift P, we're going to install some extensions. The first you'll want is, type it, remote containers. Looks like this. Remote containers. This will install a bunch of other related plugins as well that do things like give you remote server and also remote WSL2. But we're only going to be using remote containers. The other one you want is editor config. And this basically allows you to specify in your code repository various editor settings that you would like in an editor in specific way. So any editor that supports the editor config specification will be able to support this. And lots of editors do now, often with some support from a plugin. So let's go back to our code. We're going to need our editor config. So all we do here is right click, go generate editor config, So this is the within the editor config spec, you can put other editor config files in here, and for things that are not specified, it will search up the tree until it finds one that says root equals true. And you can specify other settings for different kinds of files as well. All we need to say though is end of line is line feed. Save. Great. Now all we need is a new file, and this is going to be our gitignore file. Notice we don't have one by default in the plugin generator command doesn't give us a gitignore. Now gitignore files, if you haven't seen them before, this one. If you go to a site like gitignore.io, you can generate a useful one. So if you're doing things like Django development, for example, should show something I can spell, then that gives you a useful example. But we are going to be dealing largely with Ruby and Java. Note there are no Logstash ones. So we'll create a suitable one there, copy that into our gitignore, save that. Notice it's saying line feed because we've already set our policies here. And now we should be able to do our initial commit. And start a project. Have I forgotten anything? No. Good. Okay. Now, so far we haven't actually done anything with div containers, so let's remedy that now. Now that we've got our initial project configured, let's just create an initial Dockerfile. We're going to move this. And the only reason that I've made this file here is because the remote containers feature, or div containers feature, is a bit like a source to image kind of toolset in the sense that it supports lots of different types of projects, but it doesn't know about Logstash plugin development. So we have to sort of create something from scratch. So this is an easy way of doing that. Because we've created a file called Dockerfile here, it's going to be a little bit smart, and it's going to realize, oh, okay, maybe you want to create one of these features, one of these kind of plugins. So if you use Control-Shift-P, and you go remote containers, add development container configuration files, and you'll see that it says from Dockerfile because it's found this Dockerfile here. If we had projects that looked like something else, then you'll see something else pop up depending on what it finds. However, even simple things here are more than what we actually need, so we're just going to go with existing Dockerfile. Now the other way you can get to that is down here. Open a remote window, and here we are, remote containers, add development container configuration files from Dockerfile, and what it does is it creates this special directory here, .devcontainer. Now there's nothing actually Visual Studio specific about this, other than nothing else, other than Visual Studio seems to support this notion of div containers, so it's not a standardized thing at this time, and I would love to be proven wrong about that. So basically we get this, the only thing that makes it a dev container from a repository point of view is this directory here with this file in it. And if you're creating this as for example, a Ruby project or something else, then this tends to be quite different. So let's just set this up for our purposes. For tidiness, we'll just call this Logstash plugin development. The Dockerfile that we're going to use, because it's only going to be something specific to how we use this as a dev container, I'm just going to move that empty Dockerfile that we created into there. Note that you could have a regular regular Dockerfile here, if, for example, your project, you wanted to be able to create a Dockerfile for the regular use. So because I've moved that, I need to change where I'm pointing to. When I start up a shell in this dev container, I want to use bash. You might have to change that if you were using, for example, a container image that only supported binsh. I don't need to add any other extensions in here, and by extensions I mean Visual Studio extensions. However, you certainly could. We're just going to keep it simple. We'll talk more about that in a later episode. Over here can be a bit useful. So just bear in mind, if you uncomment something over here, watch out for the trailing comma. This is how you would enable your container to run in a way that you can still use tools like strace and debuggers, which could be very useful. We don't actually need to do this here, but it is useful to know how to do that. By default, it will use the user that your container image specifies, so we don't need to override that. Nor do we actually need to do anything there after we start up the container. Okay, let's have a look. Now we have this dev container.json, which we'll save before I forget, and we've got this Dockerfile that is going to that dev container or Visual Studio is going to build and then run and then inject its extra goodness. But in here this is not yet valid because we haven't even specified what it's from. So that's the minimum that you need. If you wanted, you could do things like add other packages. Just bear in mind that you're not actually the root user here. If you were, you could have a look at the Dockerfile that is actually used. So here's the Dockerfile that is used to build this image, and you'll notice it runs as the user builder. So if you wanted to install some extra packages, then you could use user root. Just be sure to go user builder again if you want to do things like run. I should also mention this, just like the official Elastic images that you get, are based on a CentOS image. So use yum. So yum install yes required. Let's say you want to install something like strace. So that could be how you do that. Don't really need to do anything, however. Actually, what I end up doing is I comment this out and I just go from, because I've got a local image, Logstash plugin dev 7.9. And if anyone wants to contribute a working image for other versions, you're welcome to do so. So now we have a useful, or should be useful, we haven't tested it yet, a usable dev container. But now we haven't actually used it yet, so now we need to reopen in container. When you open up this repository, it's going to see that there's a dev container thing there, and it will prompt you over here, would you like to open it up? And if you've got it set up, then yeah, go ahead. You don't actually need to look at the log here. Just know that it can take a little bit of time just to get everything set up. So effectively what it's doing is it's starting up the container, and then it's inserting the Visual Studio remote code that provides all the dev container sort of magic. Now we can just close that, but what I'm going to do is show you the shell. So by default you get builder, because that's the user that was used in that container. And there is our code already in the container for us to do something with. Now in this gemspec file, and now we're getting into something that's Logstash specific, the very minimum that we need to do is, and we'll go over this more in a later example. I'm just going to make this the minimum valid gemspec file that I can. Bear in mind, I'm not aiming for something that will be usable. I'm just demonstrating something simple. Okay, so don't worry about what that means just yet. We'll talk about that in the next episode. Control J will give me a terminal again. So now we just need to hack away. So we've made some minimal edits just so that we've got something that shows, yeah, we can actually do stuff. So let's get started. Rake vendor. Bear in mind you only need to do this once, or whenever your vendored dependencies have changed. Bundle exec rspec. This is going to run the unit tests, of which there will only be one in the code that the Logstash plugin generate command creates. One green dot. Good. No big fat red Fs. And yes, it can take a while for these unit tests to run because it's JRuby. And then let's assume that worked, which it did. We'll build using that gemspec file. And hopefully we're going to end up with an actual gem output, which is our Logstash plugin. And we have, here it is there, and here it is here. Sorry, this one here. You'll notice this is this is dimmed out because this is in our gitignore. So let's just make sure that we know what's there. Let's see, here's our gem spec. That's the one we made minimum changes to, so we want to keep that. Here is, I'll say minimal change to get started. And these two here, we're going to say set up for dev containers. And then this file here is basically it's a bit like if you're a Python programmer, you might be familiar with the notion of a pip freeze command. This is essentially doing the same thing, just saying what versions of stuff were actually used. I don't think Logstash plugins generally tend to commit that to repositories, so I'm not going to. I should actually put that in the gitignore, sorry. I'll put that at the top so I can more easily see it. And that was gemfile.lock. Great. So that was easy. Now we've got a gem file. We've found that we can easily run all the tooling that we need. We've got a nice familiar editing environment, and we're ready to go on to do some actual Ruby development and create our first Ruby plugin. So I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, have fun.